Las Vegas, 1977. The lights inside the private lounge of the Sahara shimmered gold against polished marble floors. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like a lazy ghost, curling around chandeliers that had seen too many secrets to ever sparkle innocently again. At the corner table sat Dean Martin, silk suit, half smile, a glass in his hand he barely touched. Across from him, laughing too loudly, was Sam Giancana. They weren't on stage. This wasn't a performance. This was the kind of room where reputations were tested without microphones. And tonight, something was about to change. The atmosphere. Music drifted softly from the main casino floor. Dealers called numbers, chips clicked. A waitress moved carefully between tables, sensing tension the way only Vegas waitresses could. Dean wasn't laughing much. He hadn't been laughing much lately. Not since Jean, not since the quiet house, not since the empty chair at dinner. His late wife's memory lived with him in small, cruel ways. In hotel mirrors, in perfume he imagined he smelled, in songs he could no longer sing the same way. But Dean was Dean Martin. The world didn't get to see grief. The world got charm. The setup. Sam leaned back in his chair, cigar in hand. "Hey, Dino," he said, voice thick with amusement. "You still talking to ghosts at night?" A few men at the table chuckled. Dean gave a lazy grin. Only the friendly ones. More laughter. Sam wasn't done. He leaned forward. "No, really," he continued, smirking. "You sing to her empty pillow too?" The room quieted, just slightly. The kind of quiet that slips in unnoticed but changes the temperature. Dean's fingers tightened around his glass. Just a little. The line that crossed it. Sam tapped ash into a crystal tray. "Man, I always said you had great taste in women," he said. "Guess heaven needed better entertainment." A couple men looked down at the table. Nobody laughed this time. Not really. It wasn't the kind of joke you repeated. It wasn't the kind you forgot. It wasn't just about a wife. It was about loss, about absence, about something sacred. And in that moment, everyone waited to see what Dean Martin would do. Dean's stillness. He didn't explode. He didn't shout. He didn't throw the glass. He didn't storm out. He simply looked at Sam. Longer than comfortable. Longer than expected. And then he did something no one in that room predicted. He smiled, softly. But not the performance smile, not the Vegas smile, a different one. The kind that carried weight. His response. "You know, Sam," Dean said quietly, "you're lucky." The room leaned in. "Lucky?" Sam laughed. Dean nodded slowly. "Yeah, you've never loved someone enough to miss them." Silence. Not casino silence. Not polite silence. Real silence. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. Sam's grin faltered. Just slightly. Dean continued, voice steady, because when you lose someone who made you better, you don't joke about it. No anger, no aggression, just truth. And somehow, that made it heavier. The shift. The air changed. Even the waitress standing near the bar froze. Dean didn't look humiliated. He didn't look broken. He looked grounded, strong. Not because he defended himself loudly, but because he refused to let grief be mocked. Sam leaned back, clearing his throat. "Well," he muttered, "didn't mean nothing by it." Dean nodded once. "I know." And that was the end of it. Or so everyone thought. The secret no one knew, what nobody in that room understood, was this. Dean had made a decision long before that night. A decision about kindness. A decision about dignity. A decision about how he would carry loss. Because months earlier, something had happened. Something quiet. Something nobody connected to that moment, and it involved a wedding, a stranger, and a promise. The flashback begins. 3 months earlier, a small church on the edge of Nevada. Not glamorous, not famous, just white paint peeling slightly under the desert sun. Dean had been driving alone that day. No entourage, no spotlight, just silence and highway. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't invited. He didn't know the bride or groom. But he heard something as he passed. Music. Live music. And something about it stopped him. It was off-key, unsteady, but filled with effort. He pulled over. and that decision would ripple for 30 years. Back to the lounge, Sam's joke faded into background chatter. But Dean's mind wasn't in the Sahara anymore. It was back at that church, back at that aisle, back at the bride who looked like she might cry for the wrong reasons, back at the groom who couldn't afford a band, back at a moment when kindness cost him nothing, but meant everything. And that night in 1977, he knew something Sam didn't. Grief either makes you cruel, or it makes you gentle. Dean had chosen gentle. The desert road had been quiet that afternoon. Dean Martin had not planned to stop. He had been driving without direction, something he had started doing more often since the loss of his wife. No assistance, no manager, no cameras, just miles of Nevada highway and the kind of silence that forces a man to sit with his own thoughts. Then he heard it. Music. Faint. Unpolished. Slightly off-tempo. It was coming from a small white church set back from the road. The paint was chipped. The parking lot was half gravel, half dust. Only a handful of cars were parked outside. Dean slowed down. He could have kept driving. No one would have known. But something about the sound stopped him. It was not professional. It was not Vegas. It was not polished. It was human. He pulled over. Inside the church, a wedding was already in progress. There were no grand floral arrangements, no orchestra, no photographers rushing around. A young man stood at the altar in a simple grey suit that looked slightly too big for him. His hands were shaking. The bride wore a modest white dress, beautiful, but clearly not expensive. She held her bouquet tightly, as if it might steady her nerves. Near the front, a single musician sat with an electric organ. He was doing his best, but the instrument buzzed between notes. The melody wavered. Dean stepped inside quietly and stood at the back. No one recognized him at first. The minister was speaking about commitment, about choosing each other every day, even when life becomes difficult. The words echoed in the small sanctuary. Dean listened carefully. He knew those words. He had lived them, and he had lost them. As the ceremony continued, he noticed something else. The bride kept glancing toward the entrance between lines of the vows, not because she was distracted, but because something felt unfinished, something missing. After the rings were exchanged and the applause faded, the organ player attempted a celebratory tune. It faltered halfway through. There was an awkward pause. The guests clapped anyway. The groom leaned toward the musician and whispered something apologetic. Dean understood immediately. They could not afford a band. They could not afford much at all. The reception tables in the adjoining hall were simple folding tables covered with thin plastic cloths. A homemade cake rested at the center. Friends and family were setting out trays of food they had prepared themselves. It was not glamorous. It was sincere. Dean watched the couple greet their guests. They smiled bravely, but there was a tension in their eyes. Weddings are supposed to feel magical. This one felt fragile. He turned to leave. Then he stopped again. Grief had been sitting heavily on him for months. He had spent so much time thinking about what he had lost that he had forgotten what he could still give. He walked toward the groom. "Congratulations," Dean said gently. The young man nodded politely, not yet realizing who stood in front of him. "Thank you, sir." The bride looked closer. Her eyes widened slowly. You're Dean Martin." He gave a small, almost shy smile. "Sometimes." The room grew quiet as a few more guests began to notice. Dean looked at the couple. "Mind if I borrow that organ player for a minute?" The musician nearly stood up too quickly. Within moments, Dean was standing near the front of the hall. No stage, no spotlight, just fluorescent lights humming above. He cleared his throat. "I heard the music from the road," he said. "Figured it deserved a little company." And then he sang, not for a paycheck, not for publicity, not for applause. He sang softly at first. The room stilled. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the children went quiet. His voice filled the small hall in a way the cracked walls had probably never experienced. It was not a performance. It was a gift. The bride began to cry. The groom held her hand tightly. Guests wiped their eyes discreetly. For a few minutes, the wedding felt larger than the building that contained it. When he finished, there was no roaring crowd. Just stunned silence, followed by heartfelt applause that felt deeper than anything on the Vegas Strip. Dean stepped down quietly. "No charge," he said lightly. "Just promise to dance at your 50th anniversary." The groom tried to offer him something, anything, in return. Dean shook his head. "Take care of each other. That's enough." And just like that, he left. No press, no announcement, no headlines. Only a memory that would live quietly in that couple's story. Back in the car, Dean sat for a long moment before starting the engine. For the first time in months, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt peaceful. He had not brought his wife back, but he had honored what she had taught him. Love is not measured by how long it lasts. It is measured by how deeply it is given. And somewhere in Las Vegas, months later, when a joke crossed a line in a smoky lounge, that memory stood quietly behind his calm response. Because a man who understands love does not need to shout to defend it. He only needs to remember it. The wedding ended that evening with laughter that felt lighter than when it began. Guests told the story over coffee and homemade cake, still hardly believing what had just happened. But Dean Martin was already miles away. He did not call a reporter. He did not mention it in interviews. He did not tell friends in the casino lounges. To him, it was not a story. It was simply the right thing to do, and life moved on. The young couple moved into a small apartment above a hardware store. The groom worked double shifts. The bride took part-time jobs wherever she could. Bills came quickly. Arguments came sometimes. Life was not romantic in the way movies promise. But there was one photograph framed in their living room. It showed them standing beside Dean Martin in that modest reception hall. No stage lights, no glamour. Just a simple snapshot taken by a cousin with a cheap camera. Whenever times became difficult, they looked at that picture. "Remember what he said," the bride would whisper. "Take care of each other." That sentence became a quiet rule in their home. Years passed. They bought a small house. They welcomed a daughter. They buried parents. They faced illnesses. They struggled. They survived. Through it all, that wedding day remained sacred. Meanwhile, Dean continued his life under bright lights and public expectations. Crowds still applauded, cameras still flashed, but something inside him had changed. He performed with professionalism, but privately, he had become more selective with his energy. He understood now that fame could not fill absence. Applause could not replace love. The night in the Sahara Lounge when Sam Giancana made that joke marked a turning point. Word of the exchange quietly spread among circles that thrived on ego and intimidation. People expected Dean to respond with anger. He did not. And that calm response earned him something louder than outrage would have. Respect, not the kind built on fear, the kind built on character. Sam himself never brought up the subject again. In fact, those close to him noticed a subtle shift in his tone around Dean. The teasing softened, the edge dulled. Some lessons do not require confrontation. They require composure. As the decades rolled forward, the world changed. New singers rose, new styles dominated the charts. The golden era faded into nostalgia. Dean aged. The young bride and groom aged too. Their daughter grew up hearing the story every anniversary. At first, she thought it was exaggerated. Children often assume their parents romanticized the past. But the photograph remained. Proof that for one afternoon, something extraordinary happened inside an ordinary building. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the couple decided to hold a small gathering in the same church where they had first exchanged vows. The paint had been refreshed, the organ had been replaced, but the wooden pews were the same. Their daughter insisted on sharing the story publicly. She contacted a local newspaper. At first, the editor was skeptical. Celebrity drop-ins at weddings sounded like urban legends. But when the photograph was delivered to the office, carefully preserved after 3 decades, the editor paused. There stood Dean Martin, relaxed, smiling softly, no spotlight, no microphone. The article was printed in a Sunday feature titled, "The Day a Stranger Sang at Our Wedding." The story traveled farther than expected. Radio hosts mentioned it. Old fans called in. Some remembered rumors but never details. For 30 years, Dean had never claimed credit. He had never corrected anyone who assumed he had been somewhere else that day. And now, long after the moment itself, the impact resurfaced. Not as gossip, not as scandal, as kindness. The daughter stood at the anniversary celebration and read a letter her mother had written but never sent. It was addressed to Dean. In it, she wrote that his brief presence had changed more than just their wedding atmosphere. It had changed how they viewed hardship. Whenever they felt small or forgotten, they remembered that someone who owed them nothing had chosen to care. The church was silent as the letter ended. There was no way to know if Dean would ever hear about the article. Time had moved forward, and health had slowed him. But the story no longer belonged only to the couple. It belonged to anyone who needed proof that small acts echo far beyond their moment. And somewhere in that echo was the quiet strength behind the night in the Sahara Lounge. Because when a man understands the weight of love, he does not protect it with anger. He protects it with dignity. The newspaper clipping reached Las Vegas on a quiet afternoon. It did not arrive with drama. It was folded neatly inside an envelope and left on a desk in a private office overlooking the Strip. Sam Giancana had been gone for years, but men who once shared tables with him were still around. The old circle had grown smaller, softer. Age has a way of reducing volume. One of those men unfolded the paper slowly. He remembered that night in the Sahara Lounge. He remembered the joke. He remembered the silence that followed. And he remembered the way Dean Martin had looked, not angry, not humiliated, just steady. The headline read, "The day a stranger sang at our wedding." As the article described the small church, the cracked organ, and the unexpected performance, something shifted in the room where it was being read. There was no exaggeration, no self-promotion, no spotlight language, just gratitude. The photograph printed beside the story showed Dean standing slightly behind the couple, almost as if he did not want to be the center of attention. The man reading it leaned back in his chair. He finally understood. That night in 1977 had not simply been about a joke. It had been about contrast. One man had chosen humor at someone else's expense. The other had chosen grace in someone else's need. News of the article spread quietly through old Vegas circles. Stories began surfacing. Small acts, private gestures, moments Dean never advertised. A hospital visit without cameras. A check written anonymously. A late-night phone call to comfort a grieving friend. Patterns became visible only after enough time had passed. Meanwhile, the couple from the church received letters from strangers across the country. Some shared their own wedding stories. Some wrote about grief. Some simply said, "Thank you for reminding them that kindness still existed." The daughter mailed a copy of the article to an address she believed might reach Dean's family. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, a response arrived. It was brief, handwritten, from a family representative. It read, "Dean never spoke publicly about that day. But we are not surprised. Thank you for remembering him this way." There was no grand reunion, no televised moment, no dramatic final meeting, just quiet acknowledgement. And somehow that felt fitting, because the true impact of that wedding had never required an audience. Back in Las Vegas, the man who had read the article visited the old Sahara building. It had changed ownership. Renovations had altered its interior. But standing there, he could almost hear the faint echo of that long-ago conversation. He realized something important. Power fades, money shifts hands, reputations rise and fall. But character lingers. Dean Martin had not silenced the room that night with force. He had silenced it with perspective. "You're lucky," he had said. At the time, it sounded like a simple reply. Now it felt like a quiet lesson. To love deeply is a risk. To lose deeply is painful. But to care at all is a privilege. The couple celebrated their anniversary each year without spectacle. Their daughter eventually told the story to her own children. The photograph remained framed, its edges slightly worn with time. And in living rooms far from Las Vegas, people repeated the story not as gossip, but as guidance. Be the person who walks inside. Be the person who sings. Be the person who answers cruelty with calm. The echo of one afternoon in a small church had traveled farther than applause ever could. And that is how the story ended. Not with confrontation, not with revenge, but with something quieter and far more powerful. A reminder that dignity speaks longer than laughter, and kindness, once given, never truly disappears.